"That engine is finished," the experts told the CEO. Then, a single dad proved them wrong. When the lead consultant declared the $40 million prototype engine completely dead, every person in that boardroom went silent. Eleanor Voss, 29-year-old CEO of Aeronova Dynamics, stared at the diagnostic screen with hollow eyes. The biggest project of her career was about to collapse, and the man standing at the head of the table had just handed her the official reason to let it. In the corner of the testing bay corridor, nobody noticed. A low-level technician, named Owen Nash, paused his utility cart, read 2 numbers from a battered composition notebook, and keep walking with the particular stillness of someone who already knew the answer to a question no one had thought to ask him. He had written those numbers down 3 days earlier. He had not been invited to the meeting. He had not been invited to any meeting. That was the point. And the question was no longer whether the engine could be saved. The question was whether anyone in that building would let him save it. One father, one engine. And a truth the entire world of experts refused to admit. Phoenix, Arizona sat under a hard morning sky by the time Owen Nash badged in through the side entrance of Aeronova Dynamics at 6:47 in the morning. He was 36 years old, medium build, with the kind of face that disappeared in a crowd without effort, not unremarkable, so much as carefully unmemorable, a distinction that people who knew him well might have appreciated if there had been many people who knew him well. His uniform was standard issue, navy blue, worn soft at the elbows from 2 years of this particular building, and he carried a stainless thermos and a composition notebook so old that its spine had been reinforced twice with packing tape. He was Level 3 technical equipment maintenance, calibration checks, peripheral system, monitoring the kind of position that kept a facility breathing without ever earning anyone's name on a door. He made his rounds in silence, moving through the service corridors with the unhurried precision of someone who had decided, long ago, that speed and accuracy were not always the same thing. He checked pressure gauges on the secondary cooling loop, logged ambient temperature readings, initialed the inspection sheet on the east wall panel near the testing bay entrance. His movements were unusually deliberate for a man at his grade, not slow, but measured, attentive in a way that looked habitual rather than effortful, the way a person works when they are paying attention to something no one told them to track. Near the far end of the testing bay, behind a sealed partition marked with yellow access tape, sat the NX-7 prototype, the crown of Aeronova's ambitions. A next-generation turbine engine, 14 months in development, $40 million in sunk cost, and a $300 million defense contract resting entirely on its performance clearance. The final pressure certification was 14 days out, and the building felt it the way buildings do when everyone in them is holding their breath for the same thing. Owen paused in front of the ambient monitoring station mounted beside the partition. This was not a diagnostic terminal. It was part of the facility's environmental logging system, a continuous archive of temperature differentials, airflow measurements, and vibration readings embedded in the walls and floors around the testing bay. Most people walked past it without any particular awareness. Owen read the display the way another person might read a face looking for the thing that didn't quite fit, the small note that was slightly off-key. He took out his notebook and wrote down 2 numbers from the thermal variance column. Then he capped his pen, tucked the notebook into his chest pocket, and kept moving. He sent a short message to his daughter Maya before clocking out for the morning rotation. "Done by 6 tonight. Heat up your own dinner." She was 11. She knew the drill. He did not say more than that. 1 floor above, at 7:15, Eleanor Voss arrived carrying a stack of briefing folders and the expression of someone who had not slept well but refused to let that become anyone else's information. She was sharp-featured, composed, dressed with the deliberate precision of a person who understood that every room she walked into would be looking for a reason to question her authority before she had said a word. She had inherited the CEO role from her father 18 months ago, not by accident, but not entirely by her own design either. The board had needed a name people recognized, and hers was the one attached to the founding family. She had spent every day since then, working to earn a position she had technically already been given. The NX-7 was her call. She had pushed it through over the objections of 2 board members who thought the timeline was too aggressive. If it worked, Aeronova moved from mid-tier regional aerospace contractor to a serious player at the defense table. If it failed, the company would spend the next 18 months fighting for its shape. 14 days on the clock. She sat down at her desk, opened the briefing on top, and got to work. The pressure test was scheduled for the following Wednesday, a mid-cycle load evaluation at high operating capacity. Not the final certification run, but close enough to matter to everyone watching. 4 observers from the defense client's technical review team had flown in specifically to be present. 2 board members occupied the upper observation gallery. The Aeronova engineering staff stood at their stations in the control room, with the contained stillness of people who had spent 14 months preparing for the particular moment they both needed and feared. Adrian Cole, Aeronova's head of engineering, a careful, methodical man in his mid-40s, with graying temples and a habit of clicking his pen when he was processing something, stood at the primary console and watched every readout with the focus of someone who had done everything correctly and was now waiting for the universe to confirm it. The NX-7 reached operating temperature in the first 3 minutes. The readings climbed to their marks and held. 9 minutes and 20 seconds in, the room had relaxed almost imperceptibly. A half-breath released, a shoulder dropped, the small physiological concession to a thing that appeared to be going well. Then the engine stopped. No explosion, no fire, no dramatic failure, just silence, sudden and total, followed immediately by the flat, automated voice of the monitoring system. Combustion integrity, failure, chamber seal compromised, system lockdown initiated. Every display switched to standby amber. The test sequence aborted itself with the clinical indifference of a system that did not know what it had just ended. One of the defense observers stood up slowly and reached for his jacket. He said, without particular emotion, that they would need to revisit the full terms of the agreement. His 2 colleagues nodded and filed out in the manner of people who have somewhere they would rather be. Eleanor was watching from behind the one-way partition on the upper level. She did not move. Her face maintained its shape with the effort of someone who has trained it to do so under pressure. Only her hands gave her away, both of them pressed flat against the glass, fingers spread, as though she were keeping herself from leaning into the space between herself and the problem below. Adrian led the engineering team into the bay for immediate inspection. They unsealed the combustion chamber access panel and found exactly what nobody wanted to find. The thermal barrier ceramic coating had lifted and fractured in 3 separate sections, and the primary sealing ring was deformed, bent slightly inward by localized thermal stress, as though one zone inside the chamber had been running hotter than it should have for longer than it should have. Not a catastrophic failure. A precise, specific one, which was in some ways worse. It meant the system had been failing in a particular direction, and no one had seen it coming. Owen was part of the floor support crew that cleared the bay after the lockdown. He was not permitted near the access panel, and he stayed exactly where protocol placed him. But he had a clear line of sight from 17 meters away, and he used the 10 seconds the panel was open before the senior engineers closed off access. He reached into his chest pocket, opened his notebook to the page with 2 numbers on it from 3 days prior, and looked at them for a long moment. He did not say anything. He closed the notebook and continued his shift, but whatever he was thinking did not leave with him. That afternoon, Eleanor announced she was bringing in an independent expert for a full technical evaluation within 48 hours. The name that came up, floated by Harrison, the senior-most board member, a man who had been in that chair since Eleanor's father ran the company, was Sebastian Grant of Nexion Consulting, the man who had validated the Rolls-Royce Trent Series developmental program. The man whose name alone was enough to make a room stop arguing and start nodding. Eleanor wrote the name down and said she would call that evening. Owen drove home, ate dinner standing at the kitchen counter, and sat down afterward with a clean page in his notebook and began writing in the quiet of a house that had learned to be patient with him. Sebastian Grant arrived on Thursday morning, in a charcoal suit that did not call attention to itself because it did not need to. He was 61, silver-haired, with the unhurried ease of a man who had never walked into a room that did not wait for him. His assistant carried a custom diagnostics kit in a brushed aluminum case. Sebastian shook Eleanor's hand warmly, shook Adrian's with slightly less, and then asked pleasantly, with the tone of someone making a reasonable professional request, that the Aeronova engineering staff give his team room to work without interference for the duration of the assessment. He was not rude about it. He never was. Sebastian and his 2 assistants spent 6 hours inside the sealed testing bay. The Aeronova engineers were asked to wait in the corridor or return to their offices. Owen spent those same 6 hours doing scheduled calibration work on the secondary loop system 3 rooms away, hearing nothing, recording nothing, except what his routine required. The report was delivered at 4 in the afternoon in the main boardroom. Sebastian stood at the head of the table with a projected image behind him that he barely needed. He had given versions of this presentation many times, across companies and contracts and crises that had blurred together into something resembling authority. He walked through the combustion chamber inspection, the thermal imaging data, the structural analysis of the ceramic barrier using terminology that only Adrian fully tracked, delivering it with the patient confidence of a man explaining something that had always been inevitable. His conclusion, when it arrived, was stated without drama. The thermal barrier coating had experienced a manufacturing defect at the substrate bonding layer, present since fabrication, undetectable through standard pre-test inspection. The entire combustion chamber assembly required replacement. Estimated cost, $11 million. Estimated timeline, 9 weeks minimum. With the current deadline, he said, looking directly at Eleanor, the program as currently scoped was not viable. This engine is done, he said. There is no workable solution within your remaining window. The room was quiet in the particular way. Rooms go quiet when the thing everyone feared has finally been said aloud by someone with the credentials to make it final. Harrison leaned forward and mentioned, almost gently, that Stratos Aeronova's primary competitor in the defense propulsion market had made an informal acquisition inquiry the previous week. He suggested the moment warranted a more serious conversation about that option. Eleanor looked at Sebastian. She looked at Harrison. She looked at the projected cross-section of the combustion chamber on the wall. She said nothing. Owen was pushing a utility cart past the boardroom at that exact moment. The door was not fully latched. He did not stop walking, but he slowed, and he heard Sebastian's voice, the cadence of certainty, the phrase, "no workable solution," and he kept moving until he reached the end of the corridor, where he stopped, opened his notebook, and read the 2 numbers and the 3 additional lines he had written at his kitchen table the night before. He stood there for 4 seconds. Then he continued down the hallway. Owen knocked on Adrian's office door at 7:50 the following morning, opened it without waiting, and set his composition notebook on the desk. He had been in the building since 6. He told Adrian what he had found, without preamble. The thermal readings he had logged 3 days before the failed test showed an anomaly inconsistent with a manufacturing defect in the ceramic coating. The pattern was consistent with uneven fuel delivery, not dramatic, not catastrophic, but cumulative across multiple test runs. A secondary fuel regulation valve, designated FRV9 in the system schematic, had likely been delivering inconsistent flow rates at high-temperature operating bands. If that was correct, the ceramic damage was a downstream symptom, not the disease. Adrian listened. He was not a dismissive man by nature. He tried, genuinely, to give ideas a proper hearing, but he was also a man who understood where he stood and where Owen stood, and what the operational distance between those 2 positions meant in the context of a $40 million program with an external consultant's signed assessment already on record. He said, "Owen, you're level 3 technical. You don't have the authority to flag a primary system diagnosis. That's not personal. It's procedure." Owen did not argue the procedure. He asked for 15 minutes and a pressure measurement kit to check the FRV9 directly. Adrian said it was not possible. Sebastian had requested the NX7 bay remain sealed during the assessment window to preserve documentation integrity. Any unsanctioned access would compromise the evaluation record. So Owen did the next thing. He went upstairs. The assistant outside Eleanor's office told him he needed an appointment. He said he understood, and he asked her to let Miss Voss know that Owen Nash, level 3 technical, had information about the NX7 assessment that he believed was material to the decision she was preparing to make. The assistant looked at him the way people look at someone standing in the wrong hallway. Then she sent a message. Eleanor appeared in the doorway 2 minutes later and let him in without sitting down, which he understood to mean she was giving him a defined amount of time. He presented his analysis without the notebook he had it memorized, and he laid it out as concisely as he could manage. The thermal anomaly, the FRV9 theory, the cost difference between a valve recalibration and a full chamber replacement, $80,000 versus $11 million, 28 hours versus 9 weeks. Eleanor looked at him carefully, the first time she had genuinely looked at him, as opposed to looked at his uniform. She took in the worn cuffs, the notebook at his side, the particular quality of stillness in someone who is used to not being listened to and has decided that is not going to change what they say. Then she looked past him toward the window and said, "Mr. Nash? I hired Sebastian Grant, 20 years of experience, doctorate from MIT, to give me a definitive assessment. What do you have besides a notebook?" He said, "Data. And data doesn't have a degree." He said it without bitterness, the way he stated all facts directly, without asking anyone's permission to believe him. Then he walked out. Eleanor stood at her desk for a moment that lasted longer than she intended, looking at the closed door. Then she opened her computer and moved on. What she did not see was the hallway outside. Sebastian Grant was passing on his way to a follow-up meeting, and he and Owen nearly crossed paths near the elevator bank. Sebastian paused. He looked at Owen with the measured attention of a man making a quick calculation. Then he smiled, just slightly, and said, "Honest advice? Don't make things harder on yourself." Owen said nothing. He pressed the button for the service elevator and waited, but he remembered the look. Owen did not go home at the end of his shift. He was scheduled for secondary loop monitoring through the evening, legitimate, documented, logged in the system. He had access to the auxiliary data room, where the facility's ambient environment logging server operated from a rack that no one had updated the interface on since the building renovation 4 years prior. The ambient system was not the NX7's primary diagnostic network. It was the building's own continuous archive temperature sensors, airflow measurements, vibration monitors embedded in the structural panels of the testing bay, the kind of data that existed because building codes required it, stored automatically, and reviewed by almost no one. Owen had learned the interface in his first month. He pulled records for the 3 previous NX7 test runs and began to reconstruct a timeline using the temperature variance data from 4 sensors positioned within 3 meters of the combustion chamber's outer housing. The technique he applied, rebuilding a combustion pattern from indirect environmental data, was not something a Level 3 technical employee was expected to know. It was, in fact, a methodology Owen had developed himself during his doctoral research at Caltech, published 11 years ago in the Journal of Propulsion and Power, cited 72 times by researchers at institutions whose names he had stopped following. He had been 30 when his wife Claire died, an aneurysm, without warning, on a Tuesday morning in March. He had been at a conference in Stuttgart when the call came mid-presentation, a number he recognized as their neighbor, and the world had rearranged itself in the time it took to step into the hallway and answer. He had flown home in a state of shock that he still could not fully describe, to a house with a 5-year-old daughter who kept asking when her mother was coming back, and he had not had a good answer then, and had learned, slowly, that there was no good answer, only the practice of being present every morning anyway. He had left his position at Rolls-Royce North America 6 months later, not because they asked him to, but because the work had required a kind of total, world-excluding commitment that he could no longer honestly give, the kind of work that called you at midnight with a thermal anomaly and expected you to answer as though nothing else in the world required your attention. He had chosen stability. He had chosen to be present for Maya in the particular way that a child who has lost one parent needs the remaining one to be reliably, predictably, bodily there. He had taken the Level 3 technical position at Aeronova because it kept him in the field he understood, paid well enough, and ended at a set hour. He had not told anyone where he had come from. Not because he was ashamed, but because he did not want the weight of that identity pulling him back toward demands he had already made his peace with refusing. What the environmental data showed him now was precise and specific. Across all 3 prior NX7 test runs, The temperature variance at the combustion chamber's lower quadrant showed a consistent hotspot signature that intensified at high load operation. The signature was not random, it was geometrically specific, consistent with uneven fuel spray at the injector stage, consistent with a valve that was not opening uniformly at elevated pressure bands, consistent precisely with FRV9. The ceramic coating had not failed because it was defective from manufacture. It had been slowly, repeatedly, systematically overheated in one localized zone across 3 test runs until the final one finished the process. The ceramic was not the cause. It was the last thing to give way. Owen sat with that conclusion for a long moment, and then he opened his phone and searched Sebastian Grant's current advisory positions in the aerospace industry professional database he had maintained a subscription to for years out of habit. The man's credentials were extensively listed 7 consulting relationships across the industry. One of them, under strategic advisory and capital investment, was with a private equity-linked holding firm called Crestline Ventures Group. Crestline Ventures Group was the primary institutional backer of Stratos Aero. Owen found a secondary source in a trade archive, a 2-year-old article on Stratos Aero's Series B financing round that listed Crestline by name, with a quote from Sebastian Grant describing the exciting potential of the Stratos propulsion platform. It was public information, all of it, sitting in accessible databases, unhidden, available to anyone who had thought to look. Nobody at Aeronova had looked. Owen printed 2 sets of documents, 8 pages of reconstructed combustion analysis, and 3 pages of sourced conflict of interest records, put each set in a plain manila envelope, wrote Eleanor Voss on one, and sat in the data room for a quiet moment looking at the 2 envelopes before he put them in his bag. His access card failed at the executive elevator at 7:52 the following morning. The reader blinked red. The stairwell door to the upper floors. Same result. The security desk guard, someone Owen had worked alongside for 2 years, explained with genuine discomfort that a hold had been placed on his building access pending an internal HR review. The stated reason was a potential data security violation. Unauthorized access to proprietary technical systems after hours. Owen found Adrian in the corridor near the engineering offices and said, before Adrian could say anything, "Did you know that Sebastian Grant is a strategic advisor for the company that's trying to buy us?" Adrian stopped. Owen removed the second copy of the conflict of interest documents from his bag and held them out. Adrian took the envelope, opened it, and read through the first 2 pages without speaking. His jaw tightened in a way he did not appear to notice. He asked if the information could be verified. Owen said every source was listed and publicly accessible. Adrian folded the papers back into the envelope, held it at his side, and said he needed to think. He did not make any promises. He did not say what he was going to do. 1 floor above, at almost the same moment, Sebastian was meeting with Eleanor in her office. He was unhurried, collegial, projecting the ease of a man wrapping up a clean engagement. He did not mention Owen by name. He mentioned, instead, that he had heard there was some informal circulation of alternative theories about the NX-7 failure within the technical staff, the kind of thing that happened, he said, whenever a professional diagnosis was delivered that people found difficult to accept. He had seen it many times. It was not malice, he explained. With something close to generosity in his tone, it was anxiety finding an outlet. But at this stage, that kind of internal noise could distort a CEO's decision-making if she allowed it in. Eleanor asked, without inflection, who specifically he was referring to. Sebastian said he didn't want to name anyone unfairly. He just wanted to make sure she was protected from the distraction. Eleanor thanked him. He left. She called HR and confirmed the investigation. She approved the access restriction. She returned to her desk, opened the board presentation she was building for 9 o'clock the next morning, and stared at a slide titled, Recommended Resolution for a Long Time, without adding anything to it. Owen was in the lobby when he realized the envelope was not going to reach Eleanor through normal channels. He thought about it for a moment briefly, without panic, then opened Aeronova's internal portal on his phone. Under the corporate governance section, required as part of their defense contracting compliance framework, there was an independent whistleblower submission channel administered by the company's external compliance auditor, operating on a separate system from HR. His building access restrictions did not apply to it. He attached both documents. He typed a brief, factual summary of the technical finding and the conflict of interest concern. He submitted it at 11:47 in the morning. The system returned an automated confirmation. He put his phone away and sat in the lobby and waited to see what the building would do. Eleanor was still in the office at 9 in the evening. The cleaning crew had come and gone. The corridor outside was dark except for the motion sensor panels that blinked on as she moved. She had read Sebastian's written report 4 times and looked at the Stratos Aero acquisition inquiry that Harrison had forwarded with a note that simply said, "Worth a conversation." At 9:14, her compliance officer called. The independent channel had received a filing that evening, technically elevated to her attention, given that it named a current active consultant and involved an ongoing material decision. The compliance officer read the summary over the phone in a careful, neutral voice. Conflict of interest allegation against Sebastian Grant. Technical analysis suggesting an alternate failure cause for the NX-7 combustion event. Full documentation attached. Eleanor said, "Send it to my personal email right now." She read it at her desk without moving for 23 minutes. The technical analysis was 8 pages, and it was not the work of a Level 3 technical employee, she could tell within the first page. Not from the vocabulary, which was clean and controlled, but from the analytical framework. The combustion pattern reconstruction from environmental sensor data. The identification of the FRV9 variance signature across 3 successive test runs. The cost and timeline differential between a valve recalibration and a full chamber replacement. It was precise and methodical and internally consistent in a way that put something uncomfortable behind her sternum. She opened a browser window and typed Owen Nash's name into the aerospace engineering professional database she used for hiring verification. 2 peer-reviewed journal articles, 11 years old, Caltech doctoral research, combustion dynamics in high-temperature turbine systems, 72 citations. She sat with that for a long moment. Then she opened the conflict of interest documents, the Crestline Ventures Group advisory relationship, the Stratos Aero funding connection, the 2-year-old article where Sebastian had described the exciting potential of the Stratos propulsion platform in a publication that had been sitting publicly accessible since before he had signed a contract with Aeronova. She read it 3 times. Each time it said the same thing. She called Adrian at 11 o'clock. He answered on the second ring, which told her he had not been sleeping. She asked directly whether the FRV9 had been independently assessed during Sebastian's evaluation. Adrian was quiet for a moment, and the quality of that quiet told her the answer before he gave it. He said Sebastian had described the secondary fuel regulation valves as peripheral to the primary failure mode, not relevant to the assessment. So they had not been checked. Eleanor said, "If Owen Nash is correct, what does that mean?" Adrian said, carefully, that it would mean the chamber did not need to be replaced, that the ceramic damage was repairable at the fractured sections, and a valve recalibration would prevent recurrence. It would mean the engine was not dead, but he had not verified the analysis, and he could not verify it without access to the sensor logs Owen had used. Eleanor said, "Can you verify it if you have access?" He said yes. She said she would have access restored at 6 in the morning, and she needed him at the building by 6:15. She ended the call, requested a full, independent background verification on Sebastian Grant's advisory relationships from the compliance officer, cross-referenced against every organization with any stated interest in Aeronova's performance or acquisition, results needed before 7. Then she sat in the quiet office and thought about what she had said to Owen Nash in this same room about experience, about credentials, about the comfort of delegating the burden of judgment to a name that came with a doctorate and 20 years of references. She thought about the particular quality of certainty she had felt when she said it. Not her own certainty, she realized now, but borrowed certainty, the kind that feels solid because it belongs to someone else, and you have not had to test it. She was 29 years old and running a company that employed 412 people, and she had spent the last 48 hours trusting a man whose credentials she recognized over a man whose work she had never thought to look at. That was the thing she would not say aloud to anyone. That was the thing she would carry forward and use. She recognized the feeling now for what it was, and she did not enjoy the recognition. At 11:43, she sent a message to building security. Restore full access for employee Owen Nash immediately. At 12:09 in the morning, Owen's phone buzzed. He was at his kitchen table with a glass of water, not sleeping. He looked at the notification. His access card was active. He sat with it for a moment, feeling something simpler than relief. Then he picked up his keys and left. By 7:15, the compliance officer had confirmed through 2 independent sources that Sebastian Grant held a paid strategic advisory role with Crestline Ventures Group, active for 8 months, predating his engagement with Aeronova by 2 months. There was no disclosure document in his consulting contract. He had signed a standard engagement letter with a conflict of interest clause and had not disclosed. Eleanor read the confirmation on her phone, walking through the parking garage toward the main entrance, and moved faster. Owen was in the building at 6:22. The security guard gave him a nod that contained something resembling an apology. Owen pressed the button for the executive floor, and the indicator lit green without hesitation. Eleanor was standing outside her office door, not in a meeting, not on a call, waiting with the directness of someone who had made a decision and was finished deliberating. She said, "Come in. I read everything." She did not sit, and neither did he. She had the technical analysis printout on her desk, and she asked him to walk her through the FRV9 finding again in full. He did it from memory, pointing to the key data columns, explaining the heat signature distribution and the cumulative damage mechanism across successive test runs. She asked 3 questions precise, technically informed questions, and he answered them the same way. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she asked, "Can you fix it?" He said, 28 hours. If the FRV9 unit is in parts inventory, I need to confirm that." She picked up her phone and called Adrian. The board meeting convened at 9 o'clock as scheduled. Sebastian Grant arrived 2 minutes early with a slim leather folder and the ease of a man whose only concern had been traffic. He had heard nothing unusual. He took a seat to the right of the table's center. Harrison was already there, and they exchanged the brief nod of people who had known each other long enough to dispense with ceremony. Eleanor walked in at 9:03 and stood at the head of the table. She did not sit. She presented, in order, the conflict of interest finding, the source documentation, the compliance verification report, and the timestamp confirmation showing that Sebastian Grant's advisory relationship with Crestline Ventures Group had been active before his Aeronova engagement and had not been disclosed in his signed contract. She spoke without inflection. She was not performing anger. She did not need to. Sebastian did not collapse. He was too disciplined for that. He said the characterization of his Crestline relationship was being overstated. It was advisory in nature, with no operational bearing on his technical conclusions. His assessment of the NX-7 stood on its own merits, regardless of his other professional relationships. When Eleanor said nothing in response to that, he shifted. The situation was perhaps more legally nuanced than an internal review could capture, and he would recommend Aeronova involve outside counsel before taking any action that could expose the company to liability. Eleanor said, "We're terminating the consulting engagement effective this morning. That decision is already made." He sat with that for a moment. Then he picked up his folder. Patricia, a board member who had served 11 years and was not in the habit of speaking at length, looked at Sebastian from across the table and asked, plainly, "Would you like to explain your relationship with Stratos Aero before you leave?" Sebastian did not explain. He stood, straightened his jacket, thanked Eleanor for her time, with the tone of a man who had decided the situation was beneath him, and walked out. No one spoke to him as he went. The room was quiet for a moment after the door closed. Harrison looked at the table. Eleanor looked at the doorway where Sebastian had just been, and then she looked back at the room. "This meeting is postponed for 28 hours, she said. "When we reconvene, I will have a running engine." No one objected. The FRV9 unit was in parts inventory. Owen located it within 40 minutes of arriving in the engineering bay with Adrian and a technician named Marcus. It was a standard catalog component, available from the main supplier at any time, sitting in a sealed storage bin that no one had looked at because no one had thought to look. What followed was not miraculous. It was methodical, the kind of work that required knowing exactly what was wrong, exactly what it would take to correct it, and then doing that thing without shortcuts or improvisation across 22 straight hours. Owen recalibrated the valve assembly against the engine's fuel delivery specifications using design documentation from Aeronova's own technical archive. He replaced 2 adjacent injector seals, showing secondary wear consistent with the heat cycling he had identified in the log data. He repaired the damaged sections of the ceramic thermal barrier with a high-temperature bonding compound, the facility already stocked for minor maintenance. Adrian worked alongside him through most of it, handing tools and running verification checks, not speaking much. Marcus ran parts. Nobody talked about Sebastian Grant or Eleanor Voss, or what was happening on the floor above them. The work was the work. Eleanor came to the testing bay on the second evening. She came in through the side entrance in a plain jacket with no lanyard visible, and she stood near the far wall of the observation area and watched. She had been in that bay dozens of times in an official capacity. She had never once stood in the corner and simply watched without a reason. Owen saw her when he looked up from a thermal sensor calibration check. They looked at each other across the length of the bay. He gave her a single nod and went back to the work. Adrian saw the exchange and said nothing. The restart test was conducted at 6:40 in the morning on the second day. 2 of the 3 defense client observers had returned and sat in the observation gallery with the practiced neutrality of people who had learned to wait for evidence. The NX-7 started cleanly. The thermal build was steady. Chamber pressure climbed to its marks and held. 9 minutes and 40 seconds, the exact point where the previous test had gone silent, arrived and passed without event. The displays stayed green. 10 minutes. 12. 15. 20. Every sensor reading within its specified range. The thermal variance at the lower combustion quadrant, the zone Owen had been watching for 8 days, was negligible. In the control room, Adrian set down his pen and exhaled through his nose. Marcus pressed his palm flat on the console once and said nothing. The older of the 2 defense observers made a note on his tablet with the expression of someone who had just decided to return a phone call he had been putting off. Eleanor stood behind the observation glass with her hands at her sides and watched the numbers hold steady, and the expression on her face was the expression of a person standing in the specific, quiet moment that follows a long period of being wrong about something important. After the test cycle completed and the shutdown sequence ran clean, Owen began clearing his tools from the staging area with the same deliberate attention he brought to everything. He had his thermos and his notebook, and he was putting the notebook into his bag when Eleanor walked in. She came directly to where he was standing and said, "I want you in the lead engineer position on the NX program, compensation at senior level 1 engineering, starting Monday." He looked at her steadily. "I work the way I work, without a ceiling on what I'm allowed to examine." She said, "That's why I'm standing here asking you." He zipped the bag shut. "All right." He drove home in the early morning, the sky just beginning to lighten above the freeway in the particular pale way that Phoenix mornings have when the heat has not yet remembered itself. He parked in front of the house and sat for a moment with the engine off. A lamp was on in the front window. Maya had left it burning, as she sometimes did when his shifts ran long. He sat with that for a moment, not thinking about the NX-7 or the boardroom or Eleanor Voss or any of the 48 hours that had just ended. He was a man in a car in front of his house, tired in the specific and honest way that comes from having done exactly what needed to be done. Then he got out and walked to the door and went inside. Upstairs at Aeronova, the light in Eleanor's office was still on. She was on the phone with the defense client's program director, leaving a message. She said the NX-7 engine was operational, the program was on schedule, and Aeronova was ready to resume the agreement at the client's earliest availability. She did not mention Sebastian Grant. She did not mention what the previous 48 hours had taken from her or returned to her. She said what was true, in the cleanest possible way, and left it at that.